This event is the third in our new series on scholars of color. And promoting scholarship to inform policy and practice is at the heart of the Foundation's work. We execute that charge primarily by supporting early career researchers through our Young Scholars and our Promising Scholars programs. But we also believe that looking back at the work of preeminent scholars of color will broaden our understanding of their seminal contributions and focus our perspectives as we face the challenges of this moment in history. This moment in which we find ourselves living in an overall context of violence that just yesterday took the lives of innocent young children and teachers, as well as a resurgence of white supremacy that manifested itself in the recent racially motivated shootings in Buffalo. More than ever, we need these bodies of scholarship to help us understand the underpinnings and the impact of systemic racism, prejudice, and discrimination. The Scholars of Color series began in February with a look at the work of Dr. Asa Hilliard. In April, we highlighted the contributions of Dr. James Comer, and today we focus on the work of Dr. Cynthia García Coll. Each scholar's work will be highlighted in a 2-hour webinar, followed by a working paper. A recording of each webinar will be housed on the Foundation's website, along with handouts and resources that will allow a more in-depth review of the scholar's work. You can download additional resources on Dr. Garcia Coll's work directly from the handout section on the screen at any time during this webinar. On behalf of the Foundation, I extend our sincere gratitude to Dr. Garcia Coll, her colleagues, and friends for their invaluable assistance with this project. We have an esteemed panel today, and we are honored to have Dr. Martha Zaslow as our moderator. Dr. Zaslow is currently an independent child development research consultant and a visiting distinguished fellow at Child Trends. She's had an extraordinary career with a good deal of her contributions to the field of early care and education coming from her work at Child Trends and the Society for Research in Child Development. At the Foundation for Child Development, we are enormously grateful for her work with our promising scholars and her ongoing support as a thought partner. We've decided to assume an informal tone for today's conversations. So Marty, having expressed all the gratitude that I can for you and having engaged in the mute-unmute fiasco, I leave the rest of the day in your capable hands.
I'm sure that I will have adventures with mute-unmute as well. Thank you so very much for your very kind words and for the privilege of moderating today's webinar. And thank you for your years of leadership of the Foundation for Child Development. The webinar series on Scholars of Color is just one indication of the many important contributions you have made, for which we are so grateful. I was thrilled when I was invited to moderate today's Foundation for Child Development webinar to honor the contributions of Dr. Cynthia García Coll, but then I panicked. How could I possibly articulate and do so briefly the profound influence Dr. García Coll has had on the field of developmental science? How could I make sufficiently clear that her contributions are not only of her previous landmark papers, but also of her highly influential continuing contributions? For example, leading with colleagues an Srcd special topic meeting in Puerto Rico on construction of the other earlier just this month, and with a commentary about to come out for a special edition of the Journal of Research on Adolescence. I felt that the only way I could begin to convey sufficiently my sense of the enormous and ongoing contributions of Dr. García Coll would be through a metaphor. And the metaphor that came to my mind was of a tree. The tree was planted in 1996 with an extremely important paper written with a group of colleagues describing the integrative model. The model brought about a fundamental shift from taking a deficit perspective in understanding the development of minoritized children to a resilience perspective. Following the metaphor of a tree, if the broad and strong trunk of the tree is the integrative model, each of the boxes in the model has become a branch. Scholars, a number of whom are panelists in today's webinar, have opened up the boxes of the model to understand each aspect and how they work together to affect children's development. The 2018 paper, which is listed among the materials provided for this webinar on the contributions of the integrative model, identified 1,356 peer-reviewed journal articles that referred to the model in their work, and 252 that used the model as a conceptual framework or to develop study hypotheses. The review found that adaptive culture was among the most widely studied components of the integrative model, and identified 93 studies that looked in depth at how families actively adapt to the demands of their social contexts and support children's resilience in the face of racism, discrimination, and prejudice. That was 4 years ago. We know that the number of papers referring to and using the integrative model as foundational is much greater now. Through her own influential papers with colleagues subsequent to the 1996 publication, Dr. Garcia Coll has helped to foster and develop branches of the tree focusing on such critical issues as the implications of the model for developmental psychopathology and how schools can foster or inhibit positive outcomes for children of color. I have been especially excited by Dr. Garcia Coll's papers looking at how the integrative model can inform the understanding of children's development in different developmental periods, with her separate papers focusing on early childhood, middle childhood, and adolescence. We now have branches of the tree focusing specifically on racial ethnic socialization and identity development among BIPOC children and youth. Following the metaphor, as Dr. Garcia Coll notes in her forthcoming commentary in the Journal of Research on Adolescence, the integrative model has also taken root and been institutionalized in organizations in a number of ways. While the metaphor of a tree helped me, I have to say that I started to worry that Dr. Garcia Coll would find it incomplete. This is because of her role as a mentor. Dr. Garcia Coll is an inspired and inspiring mentor. In the full interview with Dr. Casadillas, from which you are about to enjoy selected segments, she describes mentoring as not just a great delight, but something she does naturally, continually, almost involuntarily. She is a true developmentalist, not only of children, but of scholars. And so I anticipate and will be eager to hear that Dr. Garcia Coll would want to replace the metaphor of a tree with one of an orchard that is growing into a forest. I think she has supported the development of many scholars who have now themselves made and are making major contributions to the field of developmental science. Each one is growing their own tree, inspired by Dr. Garcia Coll and her work, but now with their own substantial bodies of work. Please, could we have the slide with the panelists? Here are the featured speakers who will be joining soon to honor Dr. Garcia Coll, and I'll be introducing them separately with each of the panels. I urge you to read their bios and to access the websites of each of the speakers, because each is contributing important work of their own. We will honor Dr. Garcia Coll's work both through clips from the video interview and through 3 panel discussions. Please, could we have the logistics slide? We will also be reserving half an hour for live question and answers at the end of the webinar that will make it possible for you to address questions to Dr. Garcia Coll and to the panelists. Please feel welcome to enter your questions through the Q&A function at any point in the webinar. We invite you also to download the additional resources from the handout section. And today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Foundation for Child Development website. Lastly, if you would like to join in the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag Scholars of Color series. Let's turn now to our first panel. This panel will focus on Dr. Garcia Coll, the person, asking especially who are the people and what are the experiences that inspired her work. Let's start with a video clip from the interview conducted by Dr. Jose Casadillas, in which Dr. Garcia Coll reflects on these questions, and then we will ask the panelists to join us.
First, in a time where we were very much in the 1960s, this was the 70s in Puerto Rico, and so all the questioning, all the really considering why things are done. You know, there was this great saying that I laugh about it now, that it was question anybody who's over 30. So that was our logo at that time. And so we got involved in political battles, and was talking to somebody when we created the first strike to be able to wear pants to go into high school. And we went and met with the president of the University of Puerto Rico and said, look, you know, this is the 1970s now, everybody else is doing it, why not us? And lo and behold, they allow us. So the activism came very early on. My mother was also very, very political. And so we used to be involved. And so I grew up with a sense of awe at education, a sense of discovery, a sense of questioning things when they didn't feel right, to me in particular, and to find others, to find community, to find camaraderie in all of these struggles and fights. And that's where I come from a mother, a grandmother, very strong women who really believed in education as a major investment for me.
That was such a wonderful video clip and introduction to the roots of, personal roots of Dr. Garcia Coll's work. Now, could I please ask the panelists from the first panel to join me? Wonderful. So we're very fortunate to have as speakers today, Drs. Gabriela Liva-Stein, Amy Marks, and Natalia Palacios. This is a wonderful panel of colleagues whose work I respect so much. Again, I invite participants to read their bios and delve, as I have, into their websites and publications. Let me ask each of you to take about 2 to 3 minutes to comment on these questions. What is most important for the participants in the webinar to know and understand about Dr. Garcia Coll, the person? And would you say that Dr. Garcia Coll's work has been a compass or touchstone for you in your work? And if so, in what ways?
Well, I'll start by saying I'm so honored to be here. So thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm going to start with an anecdote of Cynthia and my work. I was a young assistant professor, and Cynthia and I were working on a chapter together, integrating the integrative model for Latinx rural youth. And we were on a call because Zoom wasn't popular then, and she could hear squeals of delight in my background. And she said, Gabby, what's going on? I said, oh, Cynthia, it's a snow day here in North Carolina, and my kids are really excited to go outside into the snow. And she said, hang up now, go play with your kids in the snow, because these days are just as important. And I was just shocked by this luminary in the field who I was so nervous and excited and about to work with, was telling me to be this whole person, that being an academic was just as much about writing and pushing the field forward, but living a full, complete life. And that's the lesson that she brought with us. At the same working on that chapter, she said, hey, we need to revive the Latinx Caucus. It had been dormant for some time in the Srcd. And she wanted to do this not just so that we could connect to scientists to discuss new theories, methodologies, ways to shine light on populations that have been marginalized and mischaracterized by the science, but also so we could connect as people to enjoy each other, uplift each other, connect with each other, share our triumphs, and help each other be successful. And that is what she has inspired today. So she's revolutionized the field, as will be talked about today. But how she's been a compass to me is who she's been as a person. Someone who brings resilience to all of us by inspiring us, by connecting us, by advocating for us, for fighting for injustice wherever she sees, being our voice, and paving the way for all of us scholars coming up in this forest that Marty so beautifully described. She does it with honesty, authenticity, and brilliance. And I owe my career to Cynthia, and I'm just so honored to be here to honor her today.
I'll go next. Thank you, Gabrielle. I feel the same way. I feel so honored to be here. And when I think about Cynthia the person, I just feel like in awe that I got to be her student. Even, I don't know, 20 years ago. It was 20 years ago that I first got to know Cynthia, and I still feel in awe. So When I think about her, I think about the person she is. I think the first thing that comes to mind is her strength. So for me, Cynthia is one of the strongest people I have ever known. After that, I think of the word brilliant, intellectually brilliant, but also spiritually brilliant. She is so beautiful to me in every way. She's someone with whom I feel, and I've always tried to be my most vulnerable self, and she gives me care in return. So that combination is really builds a lot of trust for me. And these characteristics, these qualities of vulnerability and care and trust are definitely not things that I encountered in my experience in academia, especially when I first started out as a graduate student. So Cynthia elicited all of them for me. And it was this ability to form this kind of a relationship that got me through graduate school. So when I first started, I remember Cynthia would ask me about my indigenous heritage, my family. And as I spoke, she would give me this knowing smile. She has this way of piercing into your soul when you look at her, and she's asking you questions about yourself. And I realized she deeply wanted to get to know me, get to know my family, why it was hard for me sometimes to go from family back to school and all of those things. No one had ever asked me these questions before. And she was an incredible support to me when I became a mother. So again, all of these personal connections, her care, just shows how much she cares about the wholeness of people, the realness of knowing our family, our ancestors, our children, all of the people that we bring with us into our work. And then another thing I thought of when I was thinking about Cynthia the person is joy. So she loves a good party. And, you know, I have some of my most favorite memories of graduate school and beyond were having fun with Cynthia and partying. She's free-spirited and she embraces the moment. She loves to dance. She loves to get loud. And as I get older and older, I know more and more deeply how important that joy is, especially when you're doing work that's rooted in social justice the way she does, the way she tries to embrace the fullness of all of it. The pain, the agony of injustice, traumas that we hold from systemic oppression, the perseverance, the drive that it takes to make long-term impacts, and then also that joy. So she helps keep me rooted in all of it. And so for me, as she is a touchstone for me, I go back to her all the time. I make my students read her work. And I return to all of these lessons that she taught me as a mentor, as a human, as a mother. And I'm just so grateful for her. Thank you for having me.
All right, I'll jump in, and thank you for inviting me to be here today to honor and speak on behalf of Cynthia. And as Gabby and Amy have done, I will have to speak to her about her as this touchstone and mentor in my life. I met Cynthia when I was 17 years old. And in case it isn't clear from the white hair, I am no longer anywhere close to 17 years old. This was at an orientation event as an incoming freshman held in a large auditorium at Brown University. And I was not really expecting to find a lifelong mentor in my first week of college. But actually, I remember it was one of those visceral moments in life where you hear someone speak and it moves you. And I remember getting chills listening to her speak about social justice and inequality at the intersection of child development. And of course, at the time, I didn't know that she was the Cynthia García Coll of the Integrative Model. And I didn't know how transformative a figure she was in the field. And I certainly didn't know how transformative she would be in my own life trajectory. And in fact, as an undergrad, as undergrads are wont to do, I forgot all about how excited I was to have found Cynthia, and I lost her for 2 years. And it wasn't until my third year at Brown that I followed an ad seeking folks to collect data in Spanish with the Dominican community. And to make a very long story short, I joined her lab and served as a project coordinator. So essentially my academic and/or research career started because of Cynthia. Even in that very first seed of passion, of listening and hearing that passion and then working with her, it really is all due to her and her passion. And so as a first-generation college student and a first-generation immigrant to the US who had no idea what research was, what an academic career entailed or how to navigate institutional spaces, being part of Cynthia's lab, being taken seriously, having her listen to my naive theories and make sense of them and connect them to, you know, existing work, was awe-inspiring. And in fact, I think of the term warm demander when I think of Cynthia, because she demonstrates incredible personal warmth, while simultaneously demanding the highest of standards. And it's both of those things. And I think that's part of what makes her special to work for, because she inspires us to give the most of ourselves. This environment she created was inclusive and supportive, and it really inspired me to pursue graduate study. The other thing that I think about was the way that she made visible for me the hidden curriculum of what it means to be an academic and pursuing graduate school, guiding what I should expect from mentors and programs. She helped me identify my passion for working with children. She helped me recognize that scholars have a responsibility to the children and families that they work with. She helped me recognize that even when our own paths are not clear, we have a responsibility to make the path easier for those coming up behind us. So, you know, we'll hear others in the next panel speak about Cynthia as the luminary, you know, whose name is synonymous with thinking about the strengths of minoritized children and families, or for highlighting the importance of contact. And all of this is true. But to me, Cynthia is a role model who inspires me to make good trouble, as the late, great John Lewis said, to make spaces and enact change within our institutions, to demand more for our communities. So I have to say thank you to Cynthia, who's a lifelong mentor to me and to so many of us, for changing my trajectory, for all that she's done for the field and for so many of us, for making us better scholars, better thinkers, and for inspiring all of us, and essentially for her mentorship. So thank you, Cynthia.
Is there, first of all, just thank you so much. This was so beautiful and moving to begin this webinar with this personal perspective of scholarship, but in the context of relationships. And when I look at your websites, I see how you're bringing mentoring into your work, which is a wonderful intergenerational transfer. So we have another few minutes. Is there any resonance that one person's comments another would like to respond to, or do you want to talk for a moment about the thread of the work from that most resonated with you that you're following up on?
I'll share that, you know, Natalia, you reminded me about her as a speaker. And the first time I actually met Cynthia, she was giving a talk at Srcd. It was the first Srcd I'd ever been to, and it was right before I started graduate school, so it would be in the 90s. But it was, you know, I watched her and I thought, and I didn't know who she was. I kind of stumbled into this auditorium that could probably hold 1,000 people, and there were at least several hundred. And she was standing at this podium and she had the whole room enraptured. She was just speaking super passionately. It was right after the integrative model came out, and it was like it was like somebody was speaking truth that I had never heard spoken in this way before. And I was just watching her going, wow, this is amazing. And then it wasn't until later that I put together, oh, that's the person that I applied to work with. And I was so humbled. I was like, somebody made a mistake in that admissions office. Like, I could not be worthy of, you know, but it was, you're absolutely right. The way she speaks, her leadership, incredible. And that demand that she has, you know, the warmth plus the demand. So thank you for saying all those things. I don't know if you can see me. I was nodding yes the whole time.
If we had one more second, when we restarted the Latinx Caucus, one thing she insisted was that our awards not be for people like her that were old, but for the youth, and that it was for people to bring people up. And I think the uplifting and of that she's done of so many people, and I never was her student, and I've benefited from her mentorship as part of a village that she has created as part of. So I think the other piece to highlight is this mentorship isn't something she just offers those who are lucky to get to work with her as you two have, but to us as a field together and as scholars who've gotten to connect with her at Srcd or at other places and learn from her, and she'll mentor anyone. And I think that's the best part. And she sees the things in us that we don't see in ourselves, or at least for me, part of that demanding is pulling things out of me that I didn't know I was capable of doing. And I think that speaks to a true mentor, that who's really able to see those strengths and draw them out.
I also just appreciated the way that you all spoke about her humanity. She sees us, even though she expects a lot of the scholar, a lot out of us who work with her, which is phenomenal. She also sees us as people. It's 25 years later and she still remembers my mother's name and asks about how she's doing. And I think that's special. I don't mean to throw other scholars under the bus, but not everybody does that.
This was just a wonderful way to begin this webinar. I thank you each so much for giving us a three-dimensional perspective as we begin this celebration in honor of Dr. Garcia Coll. Thank you so much. And thank you also for your independent contributions. And let's move on now to panel number 2. So the purpose of this panel is to turn to the substantive contributions of Dr. Garcia Coll, the frameworks and perspectives she has introduced, her own research, and her organizational contributions. We'll begin with another video clip from the interview with Dr. Casadillas, and then welcome the speakers for panel number 2. Please, let's begin with the video.
For me, good science is science that it's basically valid, that it takes into account the populations that it's studying and doesn't come up with one paradigm that just adapts, or move from one population to the other without really taking into consideration the history, the capacities, where is the population? So at some point we used to compare Blacks and whites without really thinking about anything of their context or their history. And lo and behold, using measures that were standardized in the white culture, the other culture, the Black, the Latino, every single one of them looked deficient, right? And so I started seeing that this was a need of a paradigm shift to be able to take into consideration context seriously, okay? And we are all love Bronfenbrenner, but most of us don't pay any attention. We cite him, and then in our methods and results, analysis, and interpretation, we never use it again. So I was like, no more of this. No more of putting in the front, in introduction, something that it's not used anymore. So in both places, in developmental psychology and in child development, I basically found the most amazing associate editors from all over the world. Not the US, not Europe, from all over the world. So we had people in Hong Kong, and we had people in Australia, and we had people in South America and Central America. And, I really went out of my way.
Such a wonderful part of the interview. I'd like now, please, to welcome the panelists, speakers for panel number 2 to join me. Could they please turn on their cameras? Hi. Thank you so much for the wonderful interview, Dr. Casadillas. It's just a wonderful interview, and I hope everyone will be able to watch the whole thing at some point. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Linda Haugensack, Dr. Jose Casadillas, and Dr. Deborah Johnson. And I urge you again to read their bios and visit their websites, because each one has really important work that they're contributing. I would like to ask each of you panelists, please, to take about 5 to 7 minutes to talk about these questions. From your perspective, what are the most pivotal aspects of Dr. Garcia Coll's work? Please include the role that intersectionality has in child development. And also, how did the integrative model change our understanding and your understanding of child development and research? For this panel, we're going to use PowerPoints, and I'd like to ask if we could please start the PowerPoints.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jose. I'm delighted to be part of this panel with Dr. Saslow, Dr. Hagumseth, and Dr. Johnson. It's a real privilege to be part of this conversation. Today is a sad day for me for what happened yesterday. Today is also a second-year anniversary of the killing of George Floyd. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We have lost many friends and family. So it's a tragic and sad moment, but also by knowing Cynthia and knowing her work, this is also something that gives me radical hope to be here today and to keep pushing for structural changes. So what I want to talk today briefly is about the role of theory as a tool of oppression and the role of theory as a tool of liberation, and understanding the legacy of Cynthia García Coll and her colleagues, that I also want to acknowledge how she was able to lead and work and co-create a movement, but also be co-created by a movement of amazing scholars that have pushed for change. Next slide, please. So Dr. Garcia Coll and colleagues have documented how developmental theory has historically been leveraged to justify racial subordination and reinforce white supremacy. She's done that in a number of papers using theory, using evidence, and this had a revolutionary impact on the field and in my own training. It has systematically represented youth, Black, Indigenous, people of color, youth who are experiencing intersecting systems of oppression, who are queer, who deal with disabilities, and have presented in a way that reinforces subordination. And as you know, theory has different levels and different purposes. So I want to talk briefly about description, explanation, and prediction. So the way this youth has been presented historically in mainstream developmental science is in a negative light, and this is explaining the integrated model. Meanwhile, youth, mostly white youth, are framed as a standard of adaptation. So we have description, and description is leveraged by measurement, and Cynthia has said this repeatedly. We use standardized measures, and Cynthia has helped me understand that mainstream developmental research is an indigenous psychology. It's a psychology of white people for white people. So they have created these measures, standardized measures that make many of these youth look bad. So description is done through measurement. The next thing is these so-called deficits are explained as the result of deficient culture and family dynamics. As Cynthia mentioned, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, all these youth are often presented and have been historically presented. And the way that is explained that they are underperforming according to these measures is because there's something wrong with them and their culture. So we see explanation. And explanation is enacted through training, undergrad, grad training, and hiring of faculty who perpetuates these mythologies. Third, in this framework that Cynthia and colleagues have denounced, BIPOC youth will continue to fail unless they acculturate, they assimilate. And how can they acculturate to white culture? But through interventions and policy. So that's the prediction level of theory. And this is accomplished through funding. We have a grant system that reinforces interventions and policy that at the heart, what they aim at is transmitting European American cultural values largely. So this is the critical stand as theory as a system of oppression. Next slide, please. And finally, I want to say that the work of Dr. Garcia Coll and her colleagues, for me, one of the wonderful aspects, and I want to evoke that wonderful metaphor of the tree, being someone from Panama, being an immigrant from a Caribbean country, she's part of the rainforest, right? So she's in conversation with other giants in the field that have co-created this movement within developmental psychology, like Margaret Peel Spencer, that I want to acknowledge, Bonnie McLeod, amazing scholars. There's so many that have pushed for understanding these issues, but also outside of developmental psychology. And I want to give a shout out to this amazing book by Lilian Comas Diaz of Liberation Psychology. And I love this book, and I love how the work of Cynthia is in conversation with the work of other amazing Boricua, Puerto Rican scholars like Lilian Comas Diaz. And I think she provides, Garcia Coll, the foundation for the liberation of people of color, not only understanding how they cope or how they are resilient, but how do we change systems so they can be truly free. So rather than focusing on individual responses, we need to work towards collective liberation. And one thing I love about liberation psychology and thinking about liberation developmental psychology is that one aspect that we see in this book is that before we have liberation psychology, we need to liberate psychology. So how do we liberate developmental psychology from these barriers? I'm excited to hear my colleagues, Dr. Hagunset and Johnson, dive deeper into these issues. But this demands reimagining how systems that serve youth are structured, funded, and organized. And as Cynthia has said repeatedly, it demands us to change developmental psychology from a purely academic enterprise, where the priorities are publishing, getting grants, getting promoted, getting awards, to a science centered on the individual needs of each community. What are the needs of the communities healing from racial trauma in all the parts of this country and in the world? So that's one aspect of theory as a tool of liberation that I'm grateful that Cynthia has started us on and is in conversation with other scholars.
Thank you, Jose. I really appreciate your comments and the framing of that in terms of liberation psychology. It's really thoughtful and helpful, and I so agree with that approach. I also want to thank Cynthia and the Foundation for inviting me to contribute to this well-deserved tribute and history. Next slide, please. I chose the symbol of a glass or a door surrounded by glass because Cynthia erects doorways and pathways for so many of us, and the glass really symbolizes her transparency and her honesty in her work and in all of her accomplishments. I've known Dr. Cynthia García Coll from the earliest days of my career. Always a magnanimous scholar, has served in many roles along the way, critical voice, mentor, provision of opportunities over the last 30 years. And it's a long time to know someone and to experience their wisdom and the wisdom of the work they've offered to the field and beyond. I interfaced with her immigrant scholarship through her MacArthur project, where I was brought to consult on racial socialization with immigrant youth. It was an amazing time and opportunity, and we were able to innovate a measure together, or to help expand the one that she was working on. As with many scholars of color, we don't have the privilege of limiting scope. So the work was big and it was sweeping, and the research challenges to be solved, like measurement, were just as big. They were just as immense. But we learned so much from the work, and not only about immigrant families and children, but also about what it meant to engage with the families and their very real experiences. And again, this work was about doing something better for our Black and Brown children and showing others how to erect research in these non-deficit approaches. And that was an immense task at the time, because these patterns were so difficult to break. And the integrative model, along with the the work that was being produced around immigrant youth was like a spotlight on the pathway to show others who would say it can't be done. How do we actually do this and make it meaningful and do it in the complex ways that it deserves? As she was saying in her clip, that you can't have a one model fits all. So how do you make things bigger, malleable, to be able to be more inclusive? All of this, all of the mentoring, all of the work that's done, being involved with Cynthia at any point in time meant that you are encircled by her own humanity and warmth, as was said in the last segment, and I've experienced that. And I too was surprised that a brilliant and highly productive scholar, I wasn't expecting that kind of extension of herself to other people. And it was a model about how it could be, how we can be human and provide our humanity to the people around us as we're learning together. I also work with Cynthia, or my experience with Cynthia really weaved through the Black Caucus of Srcd, which at the time was really provided an open identity space in Srcd when there were no other caucuses or identity spaces. It was kind of an open space where others could come irrespective of identity. The launch of the Latino Caucus was exciting. I remember Cynthia's energetic and welcoming recruitment efforts as she sort of moved her way through the organization to give the caucus its first life. And I was so inspired that I actually joined the caucus because it was just such good stuff, such good energy. Mostly, we're indebted to Cynthia because of her voice. Her foundational leadership and footprint as a past president of the Society for the Study of Human Development is just one of the places where she's exercised that leadership and that voice. And she's been there when we recently launched the Diversity Science Initiative, and she enthusiastically lent her social capital, her participation, her advocacy towards shaping a direction and tone for these efforts that emphasized a trust and a clear statement of that you have to be about talking about supremacy, that you have to take race head on, that you have to advocate for telling and acting on an unadulterated truth. Next slide. So I put race, this image is just about what it means to center constructs like race, discrimination, prejudice, social stratification in ecological perspective. When the integrative model of minority child development emerged, it was sort of like the time before the model and the time after the model. The time before the model, probably 45 to 50 years, while many scholars of color had really taken on an ecological perspective because it served minority populations better than some of the traditional theories, it still had this constant flaw of culture, race, discrimination, and other like constructs being peripheralized in the models. And what the integrative model did was to essentialize the influence of social stratification and racism on settings and institutions that then had their impact on child rearing and child development, the child developmental competencies. And this was just a seismic shift in what we could do, what we could understand, how we could go about the work that we needed. The effects that she looked at, or the effects that were cast in the model, along with the other important scholars who were doing this work collaboratively helped us, that pivotal box of promoting and inhibiting environments was sort of like the sift through which we move from those distal factors that then sort of rained on children to then help us talk about what was impacting families and parents as they socialized their children, and what was impacting children in their development and their developmental outcomes. So the model provided really a rich menu of concepts to manipulate to understand the richness and strength of minoritized children and their families. So this was really important because it gave us an exciting new leash on doing work, and it was really foundational for equity in science, developing equity and promoting equity in science. And we finally, rather than struggling so hard to make these models fit, we were given the tools and the jewels to really talk about the experiences as they really were and how to help us to understand them better. So this was those inhibiting and promoting environments, that segment of the model really sort of led to those broader macro system influences and microsystem protections and skill development from the family. I want to say just two quick other things before I allow my colleague to have her comments. And that is, it's important to mention how, in one of the clips, Cynthia talks about really how she invited journal editors in her time there, and how important that was for really strategically creating an inclusive environment. Similarly, I think there was a great deal of intention in the gathering of the authors and collaborators and what they had to contribute to that work, but also because it extended because they represented communities of scholarship, and because they added and elevated the legitimacy of the work and strategically spoke to the possible resistance that was to come from such a model. So that was really an important aspect of the work. It wasn't just the model that we relied on or that helped us. It was the way in which it was put into the field that also made it so critical and important and allowed us to absorb it at such a high level. The last thing I'll say is that, as others have indicated, the model has been applied to many circumstances. I would say that another example of that in the work that Cynthia and Dr. Levis-Stein did is that, again, the reinterpreting the model with Latinx and immigrant families, again, demonstrated and showcased the malleability and inclusive structure of the model, as well as its ongoing relevance and durability in the field. And I think these are important and critical ideas that will last and be with us. So I thank Cynthia for her legacy and for the change that she's erected through her scholarship and her advocacy. We're indebted and grateful. Thank you.
That was great, Dr. Johnson. I love the focus on inclusivity at the end, because that it's really a true characteristic of Cynthia. She's very inclusive. She wants everyone to have a voice at the table. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate being part of a panel with Dr. Johnson, Dr. Calzarias, and Dr. Zaslow. And I don't want to stray away too much from what I was asked to talk about. It's going to be very hard to talk about Cynthia's work without talking about her personal qualities, her impactful personal qualities. But please know, Cynthia, that I just want to say ditto to all and everything that has been said to describe you. My task was to talk about the integrative model and her broader work and how it's impacted my program of research. And I think especially early career and mid-career researchers can probably all pinpoint when they came across her work. It may not be chronological, but they can probably pinpoint that one article or that one talk or that one speaking in which you spoke that kind of like changed their trajectory. And for me, that was read her chapter in the Handbook of Parenting in 2002, Mark Weinstein's edited volume. And to me, that chapter was so liberating. I want to use that's a great word, Jose, liberating, because she introduced me to the terminology deficit model. And I'm sure it was out there before, but she was the first person in my graduate career to introduce it to me in a way that was applicable to what I was studying, which was ethnically minoritized youth and parenting and parent-child relationships. And so to read that deficit model and how she presented it to me was liberation and truth. And because of that, every conference I went to, I would look for Cynthia García Coll, and I would make sure to go to that presentation because I knew I would feel like she was speaking the truth, and it was very liberating. At that time, I want to give some context. When I was reading about the deficit model, I was a graduate student interested in Latina parenting, but with no Latinx mentors. I was at the University of Missouri. Did not see a Latinx faculty member, and someone who was actually studying at that time Latina parenting for at least the first 5 years of my program. And then eventually I did stumble upon some, but they were in different colleges. They were in the education setting or the counseling setting, but not in the developmental science area. So I would really say that Cynthia or Dr. Garcia Coll was my Latinx mentor, and I think she is this for many. She's like this omnipresent Latina mentor, academic major advisor, where she's everywhere at one time, but not physically there for all of us, and guiding us, and kind of like on our shoulder, like saying, you ask, what would Cynthia do? What would Cynthia ask? Or how would Cynthia do this? And so, without even having met her before, I've never even met her, but just through her work, she became my Latina mentor, and I know she's been like that for many others.
Linda, could
Yes.
you please fix your audio? We're hearing a little bit of fuzziness in what you're saying.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
We want to hear every single word.
Okay, I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Maybe with a headset.
Is that better?
Still not.
It's so funny. Everything was fine, and then
I know we did the tech check and everything was fine. We'll get it. We'll get it.
so interesting. Okay. So again, omnipresent academic mentor. Is that okay? Not good?
Still doing it. Do you have a headset that you might use?
No, I wish
Okay.
I did. That's fine.
I'll pass mine through the screen, Linda.
I know. Everything was working fine.
It sounds better when you sit back.
Oh, okay.
So it may be closeness to the, yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Marnie. And so I just, the deficit model, I think what was exciting for me and why it was so powerful for me was because it introduced the idea that you should consider context and that we all have continuum of experiences. And it's what kind of launched me onto my career path when I first read that book chapter. It also allowed me to, it gave me a demonstration of someone who interrogated systems. And that was kind of the first time seeing that in my area. Many people were okay with me or others doing work on Latinx children, but it was from this one paradigm, which is this ivory tower model, and expectations that yes, you can study Latinx youth, but you have to do it in a study, in the way we study or the way we've been studying white children. So her deficit model really allowed me to interrogate that and say, I'm going to on my own terms and my own rules, study Latinx children. And also helped me this model right here. So thank you for changing the slide. This model right here also, when I was introduced to it, helped me answer questions not only about Latinx children and Latinx child development, but also about my own life. So coming into this, I was like, this really helped me at a time in my graduate research where I had a lot of questions. My experience being raised by a Mexican immigrant mother wasn't really being reflected on what I was reading in the literature. According to the literature, I should not have graduated high school. I should, especially, based on all the standardized tests, I should have dropped out of school. I remember getting my master's degree thinking, did I really just earn that? And I think this model really helped me understand how and why. And then also the Immigrant Paradox. When I started to read her co-edited book on the Immigrant Paradox, that really just kind of solidified the importance of understanding the continuum of experiences and the importance of context. So in looking at the social position variables and applying it to my own life, I looked at my mother, who's a Mexican immigrant, my father, who is, if you ask him, he would say Norwegian, but in terms of privilege and power, I'd say white, and myself. And, it helped me understand that each one of us had our own experiences, different experiences in regards to number 2, which is racism, prejudice, and discrimination. And then also our residential, which I know a lot of us on this webinar study residential in neighborhoods and how that influenced neighborhoods. So these variables 1, 2, and 3, and also number 4, really helped me understand why my experience might be different than somebody else's, might be different from my mother's and my father's and other children. And then I really appreciate Dr. Johnson talking about the promoting and inhibiting environments, because I think that is where you see a lot of differences in experiences of children and why some children may fear, the individual experiences and outcomes for children, and how promotive and inhibiting that environment is, can help us understand the literature more and my experiences more. And I kind of always lived there. I lived between the promoting and inhibiting environments and the adaptive culture. In terms of the environments, I remember seeing how differentially people would treat my mother versus my father versus me, based on our social position variables. And I remember going through McDonald's and my mother moving me up so that I would do the order at the McDonald's because she was having trouble ordering and getting the food from the people on the other side. I also remember her at the same time kind of sending in my father whenever there was an issue at school, because she knew that she would be treated differently. Than my father, and she wanted that best outcome for me. And so I saw how she was treated differently than my father, and I can also see how that changed the environment that I was in school and how she handled those systems. My mother's the smartest one in my family, but she also knew that there was a system to navigate, one that prioritized white privilege, and she would call in my father when she needed to, and she worked on my behalf. So I would have a promoting environment. But really, number 5 and the other side of the model, that's where I have done my research. So I think the first part of the model, I know a lot of people have done research on, especially in neighborhoods and racism and prejudice. I feel like my work has been more on the latter part of the model. And I feel like me, myself, like I have always kind of saw myself in between them, 4 and 5. I had, this environment in these schools who treat, my parents a certain way, my mother a certain way, or me a certain way. But I also had this home environment that was very, very full of cultural pride. My mother was very proud of her Aztec culture, and she would have the Aztec sun everywhere. She made sure my middle name and my sister's middle name was Nahuatl, naming Nahuatl. And so I had this school that was kind of telling me one thing about how I should be, and then I would go home to my house, and I would be part of this, adaptive culture. And so then my research has really focused on, number really 5, 7, and 8. Whereas, like Cynthia García Coll has mentioned before, we have a continuum of experiences. One size does not fit all in terms of parenting. And at that time in graduate school, I was doing a lot of research on parenting, and I would come across a lot of the Black family scholars and Black parenting scholars who were very much ahead of their time at that time. And I would, with that and with Cynthia García Coll's deficit model, I started to think about Latino parenting and the within group differences and the within group designs, which Cynthia often talks about in her research, and the importance of that. And so because of that, it's motivating me to do an integrative literature review that looked at the within group findings on Latino parental control and child development, and what it basically helped me understand, which is something Cynthia also talks about in her work, is the importance of measurement. And so it was clear that there were a lot of mixed findings on Latinx parental control and child development, and a lot of those findings were mixed because of the measures that were being used. As she said in her interview, they were developed and normed on white European American families. So based on that literature, yes.
Linda, I'm so sorry, but we need to ask you to wrap up soon.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so I just want to say, so that's what led me to my work on measurement development with Mexican American parenting. And again, all of this is very linked to Cynthia García Coll. And I can't stop, and then the next slide is the Srcd Latinx Caucus, because I cannot say anything about Cynthia without saying all the work she's done with the Latinx Caucus, making sure that we have space to talk and to meet and to collaborate in.
Dr. Hawkinsmith, I've been reading your recent papers and I know how these themes play out in them. Thank you so much. Thank you to each of you for sharing the personal influence, the influence on communities of scholar, which I had not thought about previously, the influences on the field, and then also on organizations, and what it takes to have a conceptual change permeate through all of these levels. And thank you so much for sharing the takeaway messages. I wish we could have talked all day. Let's move now, please, to panel number 3. Where our focus is going to be on the relevance for today. And if our third panelist could please join us. Our third panel will focus on the relevance of Dr. García Coll's work today. And we did not anticipate that the context would involve 2 terrible tragedies, one in New York State and one in Texas. But these tragedies, if anything, heighten our awareness of the urgent need to take into account the contexts in which minoritized children and youth are living and the need to strengthen their development. So please join me in welcoming respected colleagues Kia Ferrer, Deborah Rivas-Drake, and Vanessa Rodriguez. And I urge you to read their bios as well and to go to their websites and read their strong contributions to that their own work is making. As I have been doing, going and reading their work, it's really meaningful and important. Speakers, please, could you each take 2 to 3 minutes to address these questions? From your perspectives, what impact has Dr. Garcia Coll's work had on child development research? And what is the relevance of Dr. Garcia Coll's work to understanding children, the development of children and youth in the context of the pandemic, the social justice movements, and the recent tragedies? Thank you.
Well, I can go ahead and get started. I want to make sure my audio is okay. Is it okay?
Yes. Yeah.
So I want to join everyone else in just acknowledging Cynthia's personal impact on my career and thinking. I think, I mean, there's no one, I don't think, probably in the virtual room who has not been impacted by her work in some form or fashion. And I was lucky enough to have worked with Cynthia in a couple of settings, and just to have her continually be a presence in my professional life. I first got to know Cynthia as a colleague when I was an assistant professor years ago at Brown. And I'm so lucky, I think, feel really grateful that I got to know her as a departmental colleague and leader, and kind of what she is. I know she's this tremendous figure in the field, and really what she's like, in a department. And the role modeling definitely extended. I don't know if you were aware of this, Cynthia, but I saw you as a role model in the field, and then of course as a role model right there in-house, and it has meant everything for me. And I know for many women of color and Latinas in particular, as we've heard already through this webinar. One thing I really want to note, and then I'm going to move on to the more substantive part of the question, is that I noticed, and I don't think anyone who knows you hasn't noticed this, the ethic of care with which you treat and have treated so many people in different environments. And definitely, I remember that it was very striking to me at the time. And everyone from students to colleagues to staff. And it's really, really important to note, because as we've already heard, Cynthia is the person and the work, and they're really interrelated, and part of that interrelationship is the humanizing approach that she takes to everything that she does. So I really appreciate that and wanted to name that. She's, of course, has had a tremendous impact on the field. Foremost, I think, through her vision of what the field could be. I mean, there is a before the 1996 and post 1996, and part of that transformation has been through the scholarship, obviously through the integrative model, as we've already heard, but also in what others have said, the opening of the doors. I think Cynthia said at one point in a talk that she's not alone, or she doesn't feel like she's alone anymore, and she kind of sees these new generations of scholars coming up and kind of taking up the work, right, and really carrying forward the work and the baton, let's say, and or carrying the torch, and I think that it's because she's not alone, because in every room that she's in, she's made room for everyone else to come in, and as a colleague, as a member of our university at the time, as an editor, that can't be understated, and as a leader in our professional organizations. And another thing I really appreciate about you, Cynthia, is that you consistently name all the other women and women of color in particular who have been part of really changing the field and changing the scholarship and legitimizing, the scholarship that, you have enabled through your theorizing and through your empirical research, and has allowed really so many of us to be able to participate. As an editor, I'm going to say just a couple of things, because I got to know her in that capacity. I was really lucky to get to know her in that capacity as a member of the publications committee and as chair for Srcd. She has edited, if you didn't know, 2 of our top journals, Developmental Psychology and Child Development. And that is already, she spoke in the video clip you saw, just the approach with which I feel like I'm speaking to Cynthia and also, about her in third person, but, in what counts, what is legitimate scholarship, what is high quality scholarship about racism, what does that look like, and, why, how can we bring it into the fold of our mainstream journals? Another quote I have always carried with me, I don't remember if you, I don't know if you remember saying this, but I think it paraphrasing is something to the effect of like, you're really against the segregation of the science. And I really has always resonated with me, just the idea of like, it just needs to be part of like our understanding, and the times we're in now really underscore that, right? That racism, oppression, it's just part of the picture of human development, it's part of the theorizing, it's part of the work. Like it is, you know, it just needs to be part of our science, you know, and these ideas and concepts aren't like peripheral or marginal, right? They need to be brought into the center. And we've heard a little bit about that from Deborah already, and others. I want to take a minute and then I'm going to hand it off to my co-panelists to say that these impacts of her vision and her leadership and scholarship, she notes elsewhere in the video, which I think if you have a chance to see it, you should watch the whole thing, that it really hasn't, you know, it has come at a cost. And I think, or maybe it's it's actually in the piece that you wrote for JRA. And I want to just be totally clear about this impact. And in the part of the role modeling, for many of us, we need to acknowledge that, you know, her impact or your impact has been not only transformative, but transgressive, right? And you really speak truth to power all the time, constantly. That is something that, you know, we all have witnessed. And that, you know, in dealing, how do you deal with, you know, backlash, with, you know, naysayers, with people who are resistant to paradigmatic shifts or paradigm shifts in our field, because that's not going to really happen easily. And it's to your credit that you have spent 30 years or more really pushing, and that we're here and we have an orchard, like a beautiful rainforest of trees, because you have persisted and you didn't stop. There were so many places, I think, at which you probably could have said, okay, I'm done. And you haven't, and you've just kept, you know, carrying the work forward and being a role model for us, and how to do that with integrity and grace. And I really appreciate that. And so I'm gonna stop there.
Who would like to go next?
I can share. I had kind of separated these two questions, so I'll answer the first one, and then Kia, I'll pass it to you. When I started thinking about just the impact of Dr. Garcia Coll's work on child development, I thought it was really interesting because prior ecological models really place the individual at the center. And while that may seem appropriate and even noble, when researchers then study populations of color, they'll often consider the individual the cause of the problem because they're at the center. And so the focus becomes how to modify the child rather than how to modify the system. And in Dr. Garcia Coll's model, she considers the great impact that the societal constructs have on that child. How do all of these isms affect the child in ways that they actually have no power over? However, I see this question as even more than what you asked. I happen to use Cynthia's work to better understand women teachers of color in early childhood like myself. Her model isn't just useful for child development, it actually offers us a critical lens for how to understand other minoritized populations within early childhood, like the educators. You see, we know that our early childhood educators are nearly all women. We also know that there's a dominance of women of color teaching our children living in the most underserved communities of color. And these women have also faced racism, sexism, segregation, poverty from the moment that they themselves entered the education system as young children. And what Cynthia's work has laid the foundation for is for researchers to understand that these teachers of color who were these young children in this education system, what is their relationship and their practice that they engage in with their students of color, both within the context of the societal constructs that impact them as teachers of color, as women of color, and then the students of color that they teach, both past and present. So it really is quite a different way of looking at child development research that's not just about looking at the child using her work.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm Kia Ferrell. First off, just wanted to thank Dr. Garcia Coll for me being here and for the foundation for inviting me. I'm really just so grateful for this opportunity. So to answer your question, I did the same thing Vanessa did, so I'm just going to kind of put them together, but it's easy to talk about Dr. Garcia Coll, right? I think the question on the COVID-19 pandemic and social justice movements and natural disasters like Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico have all kind of increased public awareness, right, of the broader issues regarding the equal rights of each child, especially in underrepresented communities. And so I think Garcia Coll's research helps us identify some of the many causes for these disparities and then move beyond that understanding by creating actionable solutions. I had the pleasure of doing research with Dr. Garcia Coll. We dove into the historical understanding of Head Start, which is an early childhood education program. We also kind of looked at the families and how they perceived the books on Head Start, how institutions implemented those pre-service training materials. We really dissected these books to understand how Edward Ziegler, one of the architects of Head Start, how he can conceptualize children of color, right? And I think, understanding the historical underpinnings of a program help us figure out what has worked and what isn't working and what we can change in the future. So when I think of her research impact, I think of that real change in the real world, right? It's not just the papers she wrote or the poster presentations or the journal articles with her names in it, but real things and real people and connections. And in order to accomplish that, you have to create relevant audiences, connect with people and understand and apply and have people advocate for your research so that we can take responsibility and acknowledge new perspectives and propose actionable solutions. So just to go back to your question and sum up from my perspective, I think the impact, not only on my life and my research and thinking about the integrative model and using that framework to really consider all the disparities and all of the multitude of social and cultural factors that influence child development, but it's moving beyond that and creating relationships with people, sharing that understanding, reflecting, so that we can create more effective programs, build new institutions that better meet the needs for historically and currently minoritized children. I think today's panel is a great example of that. Thank you.
So much.
Yeah.
And we're going to need to transition soon to Dr. Garcia Coll, but I wanted to cycle back to you. Dr. Rodriguez, did you want to just complete?
Yes, just quickly. And Kia, as you shared, I mean, like many of you today, I am mourning the 19 children murdered yesterday in Texas from yet another mass shooting and the second anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. And as a mother, a teacher, a researcher, and a brown-skinned Latina, I feel completely lost and powerless. And I remember feeling the same way at the start of the pandemic and the social justice movements that spring and that summer. And it's in these moments that I look for something just to ground me. I look for places of strength, of resistance, and growth. And I can always find that in Cynthia's work. And during the pandemic, I interviewed pre-K teachers here in New York City during lockdown. And these teachers who were white taught predominantly Black and brown children living in urban poverty while they lived in upper middle class suburbs. And they spoke with great pain that they endured as they too felt powerless in helping their students. And as I listened to their trauma, I also heard deep racist remarks, beliefs about families, claims that these parents just didn't care because they weren't signing their 4-year-olds onto virtual classrooms. They mocked parents who didn't understand the classroom communication that was sent home. And though through this all, I stayed grounded in Cynthia's model. As I listened to teachers' stories about children, I held constant the societal and family constructs that were impacting them. It both enabled me to better understand the immense hardship, fear, and upheaval that the children were enduring, regardless of how the teachers described them or their families. But what I'd really like to highlight is how Cynthia's model also protected me as a brown-skinned Latina researcher and as a mother of a pre-K child. As I listened to these teachers deeply during the interviews and then later during the analysis, I had to continually come back to the integrative model to just shield myself from what I felt like were personal attacks on my culture and my mothering. Because you see, her model doesn't just help us to understand the development of minoritized children, it helps us all as researchers to understand ourselves. And that's what you see in this panel, all of the panels today, to feel like we as researchers are not the other, that we are not less than. It empowers us as Latinos to engage in early childhood research in support of young children of color, because it also tells us that we are worthy, that the problem is not with us, that we are not the deficit. Rather, we can use our skill set and resist and persist and thrive. And so just closing what I wanted to share.
Thank you, panelists, so much for these eloquent and important words. And what a perfect segue to invite Dr. Garcia Coll to come and respond to these comments and the other perspectives. Thank you all so much. If we could please ask Dr. Garcia Coll to join us.
Okay. Let's see now. Of course, I'm doing exactly as
Oh,
Jacqueline.
it's okay.
Share my webcam. There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you, and just share your webcam. Everybody is so eager to see you too.
Share my webcam. There we go. Oh, wow. I just hope that everybody who has had such a nice words and deeply meaningful and deeply touching descriptions of my work and my colleagues' work and my students' work can be here in 10 or 20 or 30 years. That's always my hope, right? I come from, they used to say collective cultures, which we know that that's a very minimizing, it's not complete. I mean, we're more than collective. There's a lot more things that go on. So
Please
let me
check your camera, please, because we're not seeing you. And I know people like to see me, but they really want to see you.
No, you're not. They are?
There we are. There we are. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, Jacqueline and I are connected. What can I tell you? The beginning and the end. All right.
Okay.
First of all, I want to give a lot of thank yous. So I want to thank the foundation. Many of you do not know that my first funding was as a scholar from the Foundation for Child Development. That was the first funding that I ever received. And so to be here 30, 40 years later, hearing the impact of the work that started so small and so, insecurely at the moment, of really trying to figure out how do you get funded for this kind of work. It's great to be at the beginning and at the end of my career connected with the foundation. So I'm deeply thankful for that. I'm deeply thankful for this this webinar and this way of really highlighting people's work and life and the contributions. I mean, it feels like a better way of doing a Festschrift, which is what we used to do, right? Because it's more personal. I just wish we could hug at the end of all of this, and maybe in the future when we don't have a pandemic, we can do this. I want to thank all of you, the participants of this webinar that took the time to be here. I know that you have busy lives, not only because you have an academic life, but also because we talk a lot about our personal lives and how, the dual role of being parents, conscientious parents, mothers and fathers, conscientious scholars and conscientious teachers and everything else, it really takes a lot of energy to do that. One thing that I want to emphasize, and then I just want to open up for questions, because I like debate and I like talking with people and I like shooting ideas and saying what's right and wrong and debating and everything else, is that, the way that I've always approached my work and my family work, all of my work, has been, it takes a village. I mean, I've always surrounded myself by people who are aching, spiritually and socially, and we believe in social justice. And that's not only my nannies, you know, and my students and my coworkers, but it's really tapping into systems of support that need to be there. I mean, this emphasis in the United States on individuals and individualism really is very tied up with a way of looking at the history of the United States. You know, you go west, my dear, you go west and you conquer. And I am really showing, my life is showing how having a collectivity that you work for, that you care for, and that on the other way it gives you back is a way of having a real good life. And I know many of you are doing exactly the same. I also want to emphasize that when we published the integrative model, which took about 4 years of funding from the Bureau of Maternal and Child Health for all of us to sit there, and every single one of those boxes were 6 to 8 months or something like that, that the notion of this model is that as long as one of us is oppressed, we are all oppressed, right? That the oppression of one group, I mean, we're not competing for oppression here. We're not competing to who is the most oppressed. We're saying as long as the construction of the other guides, policies, practices, discrimination, all of this really hurts society. And society, we are all part of a society that if there's one part of society that is not working, it's not going to work for all of us. Even if we, you know, put ourselves in an ivory tower, it's going to get back to us. And the last thing I want to say is that this is not within child development. This is not an ideological battle. This is a scientific shift. This is a paradigm shift. This is really trying to get the science of child development be the best that it should be in order to be able to serve the families and children that we study. This is not my ideology against you. This is not an us and them. This is getting the science to be the best that it can. These are scientific issues, and I just want to be sure that people hear me on that. This is not ideology, this is science. And I am striving for a better science, and I know we all are striving for a better science. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much. And why don't we now ask all of the panelists to join us for the question and answer with Dr. Garcia Coll. And this will be a moment for virtual hug when everybody comes to join you.
And a picture.
That it can't be in person, but it will be a virtual hug,
Thank you.
And are there any final comments that any of the panelists want to make before we turn to the Q&A? Any reactions or thoughts carrying through?
I think that you missed to say.
Just I know how grateful we all are and how that just came through, the influences on individuals, on communities, on the field, on organizations. Thank you so much. We're so deeply grateful. So we're going to start off with a question that has to do with application of the work. This is a question to Dr. Garcia Coll and to all of the panelists. Could you please talk about how your work has been used and can be used in the future to inform policy and practice? Could you start us off, Dr. Garcia Coll? Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm going to start and then I'm going to open up for others to please follow. You know, I think some of you said it, that the emphasis, maybe it was Vanessa that said it more out there, that the emphasis on the individual really points out that we, mothers, families, children, are deficient. And that, you know, this shift here is to the context. It's to really think about the power of context, which we all theoretically believe in. But then when we do the studies, many of us go back and do what psychologists do, right? We measure the child and the mother in a very much a vacuum and really articulate deficits for parenting or for child development based on a very narrow way of thinking about how families operate, how children develop, etc. So for me, that is a huge shift, because then, you know, programs like Jeffrey Canada's work, which I still have some problems with Jeffrey's work, but you know, that's a different story, really brings about the notion that if you want this child to really blossom in the garden that we were talking about, that we really need to have a whole set of contexts, really talking to each other, really supporting each other, really getting into the strengths of what we have in schools and communities, you know, the neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it really shifts how we can think of early childhood education. Can we change life trajectories by just working with children in a classroom? Okay, and this is the kind of hard questions that we need to be asking for every single one of the systems that we work. Can we change a mother's behavior without taking into consideration all the life stresses, everything that she has to put up on a 9 to 5 job in order to then come home and be nicely sitting by the bed reading a book? All right, so letting it go. Guys, it's all yours.
Would somebody else like to jump? Go ahead.
I think one of the other differences also, Cynthia, in your work is not just to look at the society, but to consider that the culture in which we live in is not a deficit, right? Because even for research that is done considerate of the culture, right, considerate of societal impacts, what they'll often do is then take the child out of that and say, well, we're going to take them out of their home, right? And we're going to place them in this white environment because that's better, right? That's the best they can have. So we're going to pull them out of their mother's home and we're going to put them in a school from the crack of dawn to the late evening. We're going to make that all completely white, and then they'll do better. Whereas your work is saying, no, we need to understand their culture from a positive lens, from a lens of empowerment and justice. And it is on us to then figure out, now, how do we engage with the entire community, with the entire life of this child, especially in minoritized communities that are often very much connected, right, and not individualized. So it's also quite different there, not just the realization that societal factors matter, but that they can be looked at from a different lens and not a deficit model.
Good point.
I wanted to jump in and say something. I listened to Gabby talk about this at the meeting in Puerto Rico a couple of weeks ago. And I think one of the very clear messages that comes out, and Gabby, you can talk about this much more because you said it, but it was the centering of community and community's needs that to me comes straight from Cynthia's work. And echoing what Jose said about the lack of perspective on this from funding agencies is a real problem, because those are coming, it's like the outside kind of framework of like, oh, we have to impose this idea or this intervention, and we're not really funding community-based intervention. So let you speak on this, but I think that's critical.
No, I was just going to say that the one piece that we've been taking in terms of policy is delivering mental health interventions with community health workers, right? Folks that are in the communities, living the lives of folks, know the contextual pieces. We're not going to be able to write that into a manual. We're not going to be able to write that into an intervention. It's empowering the community to help themselves and to give them the tools that we know can be helpful, that we know can be useful from our science, but then empowering them to use it in the ways that they see fit too, right? And to bring it together to life. And it's been hard, I will say, that I've been working in these policy spaces and having all these meetings with different folks. And I don't know if it's going to work or not work, that we can get this funded, but at least I'm trying. And I think that's the inspiration that when I said that, yes, well, when I said that Cynthia said things that I hadn't seen in myself, this is one of those things, right? That being around this and being surrounded by people doing this work to continue to inspire is so important.
else want to comment on this?
Just one more thought. Just back to some of your early work with immigrant youth and children, just thinking about how complex that work was and how many people would have told you never to do it that way, that you study one group, one language group at a time, and that you were brave enough and bold enough to say, well, but that's not how we live. We live, again, in those communities, and those communities are complex. And so we have to throw all the balls up in the air and also give each ball a space to fall and bounce, right? To have its own life. And the working that out in real time while the work was being done is the lesson for all of us about how to do it, and then capturing that for us so that we have, a way to see it and a way to do it, and a way to say to others. So for us in the field and for us doing work with communities of color, it was a legitimizing point, right? It was an ability. It gave us some force and legitimacy to say, no, we don't have to do it that way. We can do it this way, and it comes out, and you can publish it, and we learn more, and we learn better, and we learn about strengths. We can study strengths and still have and have the best science. That's the model and not the other.
I want to add something to that, because Natalia was at the beginning of that study and Amy was at the end of that study. And what we ended up learning from that study was that the immigrant groups have things in common and things very different, both. Okay, and it's like I don't know why we're very dichotomized human beings. We want one way or the other, and it's both. They're universals and they're community specifics. And it's an empirical question. We can't assume that because we study one process in one, that it's going to generalize all because they're all immigrants. I mean, these were all immigrants. These were all children of immigrants, but we contextualize it by having the qualitative part of the, ethnographies for 1 year in each of the communities to really understand deeply what was going on. And at the same time, we found some commonalities. And it has to be, you need to be like Sherlock Holmes, and really have a theory behind, but be open to be proved wrong. Proved wrong. I mean, you have to be open to the data. Your theory can change, and as you've seen, many people have changed the model. You have to really be open for people, communities, to inform you, to teach you what you thought it was right, and where were you wrong. It's an open question.
One of the issues that's come up in this conversation now is the issue of funding. And we got a very important question about that from one of the participants in the webinar. And I'd just like to read the question. It's a long and detailed question, but very important. Right. And the question is, procuring grants is a rewarded marker of academic currency. Not all grant invitations will center or do center on social justice, structural racism, and oppression. Right. How should we, as social justice committed scholars, navigate this marker metric of our success, which so often pushes us to explain interrupt deficit thinking?
Very good question. Most of my funding was foundations. Okay, so that's where I basically went to. It was the WT grant, was Spencer, was all of this foundation. But the other way that you can do it is that you can write a grant that sounds, and this is awful, generic. And then you can add, after you get funded, everything you want. And please don't tell other funders, aside from the Foundation for Child Development, to do this. But I really think that there are ways. The other thing that I say to people is wait until you have tenure. You're going to have another 30 years after you get tenure to be able to do the work the exact way. I mean, the freedom of tenure, my goodness, I hope it doesn't disappear, although I see it disappearing in many places in the nation. But after you get tenure, you have more of the flexibility. The other thing is, you know, I did most of my research with undergraduates, as Natalia was saying, and Amy knows that we had a group of probably 20 undergraduates working with us, you know, and it was for them, it was transformative because it was for me transformative to do research when I was a sophomore in college. You know, for them is transformative. And at the same time, it was really, we had people from all shades and colors and places that they came from, and that could really have an interest on the cultural relativity, but also had a sensitivity to being considered part of others. Of course, we need to, the same way that I decided my contribution was in the editorial aspect. It's not that I love to be an editor. It's just I needed to be an editor because if I wasn't going to be the editor, I needed to break the concrete ceiling. Talking about it very clearly, it was not a glass ceiling, it was a concrete. And others can really think about that what they want to do is shape NIH or NIMH. Or foundations. I mean, we need people, as I said in my commentary, and as I said in Puerto Rico, we don't only need us to be part of the conversations, the scientific conversations, the decision making, the practice and the policy, we need to be in power, in positions of power. And we need to bring others along us. And we need to change institutions and organizations. And that's unfortunately the burden of being the other, right? I mean, it's the burden of being, from some of you who have been the token Latino or the token Black woman or the token, you know, Latino man or whatever it is, you know that people are gonna come and ask for great things, and I'm not gonna say the word, stupid things that you have to put up with and smile and answer in ways that you say to somebody, you know, you don't know what you're talking about, but let me explain it to you in one way and another. So power is necessary. I mean, getting into position of powers, I'm sorry, we need to be department chairs to change, you know, tenure decisions. We need to be, you know, provost, we need to be presidents of university, and we need to be presidents of foundations, and we need to be presidents, you know, whatever, directors of NIMH and NIH. And each of us can do it in whatever aspect. But that's the way we're going to change the field.
You did anybody else
want to comment? Guys, a little burden on each other.
You've never said it would be easy, right? And you have fought.
Nope.
Is there anybody else who wants to comment on this, or should I go on to the next question?
Funding.
I was just thinking while you were talking, you know, funding goes with power, right? And the part of the bias, I think, in funding is this bias against other ways of knowing other than the more quantitative, traditional kind of, and when you look at a model like Cynthia's and the models that we all use here on this screen and the ways that we encounter our work in community, that requires us to do things like Cynthia's study she was talking about that Natalia started with her, that's ethnographic, it's interview-based, it's quantitative, but it's mixed all together because you can't get at that complexity or that community without a really beautiful embracing of mixed methods. But when you go to write a grant, that's not what anybody wants, right? They want this really traditional, big N study with complex models that were developed in totally other contexts in a very racialized, biased way. So, you know, for me, I think that's another piece that's really hard is when you want to embrace the community approach, when you want to embrace the complexity, you start to think, okay, we need to get into other ways of knowing that just aren't valued. And so I agree with you, Cynthia. We need to get up the ladder and start to embrace other ways of knowing.
I just want to jump in and say that one thing I've appreciated about Cynthia, many times I hear you, and today you just reminded us of like just really being explicit about what we consider to be rigorous, and like there's really rigor. I mean, there's rigor in all kinds of research and all kinds of methods. We haven't really spent a lot of time on the seminar talking about your methodological contributions, but I do think that's been really important. I think that it's been trailblazing as well, just to think about, how do you do really rigorous, kind of work where it's within groups, and then what does that actually mean, and what does it mean for your measurement? What does it mean for like your conceptualization? What the predictions and the questions that you're even asking? And I think that you have been really thoughtful about all of that and have also modeled that for so many of us. And I think, I wonder on your perspective on whether things are getting better, because I think one of the contributions of not being like the only, sole voice in the field is that there are enough people who are really trained with that idea of like rigor looks different. And, there's like rigor in a lot of different approaches. And we are all reviewers, and we're all grant reviewers, possibly. I reviewed my fair share of grants and papers and, done the editorial thing and all that. So, we're all in those positions, and, we also are changing, right, expectations of what constitutes excellent science about and with these communities and issues.
You guys are doing it. You are being invited now to review yourself, to review grants. As I say to students, get on the volunteer review of child development and other journals, so you learn about the process, etc. I just want to say that in our work, at the point that we started dealing with children of immigrants, the catchword is children of immigrants. So there was no sense of ethnicity and race within that, and that's what we broke in our study in the immigrant stories, was this notion of heterogeneity within immigrant, the Cambodians, the Dominicans, the Portuguese being said. But then we turned around, Amy and I, and wrote a grant, and we went to Ad Health and other large data sets. And we started looking to see what we had found in particular communities could be replicated. And some things were replicated and some were not. So you need to be, and that got funded by the WT grant at a very much higher level than the other one, the original one. So you need to bring about the data that supports the paradigm shift, right? You do a small study, use that to support and say, this is okay. So we found this. This is the next step that we need to do, and use some of those major, more traditional methods.
We have time for just one more round of discussion, and I want to follow up on a theme that emerged in Dr. Rodriguez's presentation, which is early educators. So Foundation for Child Development is very committed to early care and education, and especially the workforce. Could you talk about the implications of the integrative model for preparation of early educators? And this is a question for you, Dr. Garcia Coll, and a question for others as well.
Okay, so I'll start briefly. Kia Ferrer and I just published an article that it's in the Journal of Developmental Psychopathology, right? And what we looked at was the sort of theoretical underpinnings of Head Start by looking very, very in depth into the writings of Ziegler, who was the sort of the main architect of, and we found how his, early writings were very much part of a deficit model, right? And then by the end of his writings, he was really, partly because of criticism from Mamie Clark and other people who were around, but were saying, wait a second, we can't be putting all these kids in a box and all these families as deficient. He started talking about the kids differently. But what was fascinating is that her analysis of how the teachers are being trained right now it's still reflective of the earlier Ziegler and not the latest Ziegler, okay? And so we have found an area that really needs to be dealt with. It's the training of professionals, of teachers from early Head Start to college, right? On how teachers are gatekeepers, on how, principals need to be hear this stuff on how, if you want to change that system, you really need to change the options, no, the way that they're thought of. And Amy, I don't know if you remember that in one of our groups, what teachers thought about the kids, and also in our analysis that you did with Native Americans, and they were in kindergarten teachers, right? I think it was kindergarten teachers, what the teachers thought of the ethnic group that they were teaching was predictive 4 or 5 years later. All right, so this is a clear area that we need to deal with, is how do we start changing textbooks, right? Publish out there for this particular population, so they get embedded in the teaching of these professionals that really matter tremendously in the life course of our kids.
Anybody else want to comment on this? It's so interesting to hear the extension of the model from children and youth to adults. It's so important.
I wanted to add, I think something that was said a few times before is that the integrative model and just Dr. Garcia Coll's framework on studying minoritized populations can work for so many different settings, right? I'm in pediatrics, I'm in healthcare, and even though we talk about early childhood programming as, you know, multiculturalism and globalization happens and it's inevitable, you know, the face of pediatrics, the face of education is going to change, right? And so to use that integrative model across all settings that also integrate care. So whether it's, you know, behavioral health care, developmental services, medical services, you know, primary care, I think, you know, being able to use that framework across all early childhood workforce, it's not just programming, but health as well, I think it is an even, you know, a greater impact than, you know, just for early childhood programming.
And I would stamp out the word diversity. You know?
Yes, also we are trying to debunk the word diversity. That is a huge, you know, we found in our research, and then I'll allow someone else to speak, but in our research, the cultural standards of different accrediting organizations, the cultural standards still has deficit language within those standards. It still has diversity training, you know, from an ethnocentric perspective. So diversity training literally means I'm going to teach you how to work with the non-mainstream culture. And so, yeah, that's many impacts, but I digress.
Yeah,
So we're gonna, please.
Go ahead, Marty. If we have to end, I can.
No, Vanessa.
Okay. Please.
So I'm very fortunate in that I am an FCD Young Scholar, and they have really allowed me to make the argument that if we are really studying deeply our early childhood educators, we are doing a service to better understanding our young children. And so they really have given their full support behind this work. And what I find critical is that if we know that we would like teachers of color in the classroom with our children of color, right? And if we know that in early childhood, we're really talking about women, what that means then is we need to consider that their experience with education has been one of trauma, right? And so when they then decide to take this on as a profession, it is often that they are saying, I want to prevent what I experienced as a child. I don't want this to happen to more children. But then they get into teacher education programs that are looking to train them, right, in the right way of how we're supposed to educate children, rather than saying, let us look back to your experience as a child. Let us look to those contextual factors that even after all that trauma caused you to feel like you had to go into the classroom to support these children. And therefore, how should we approach your education quite differently? And it has to come from a place of knowing and understanding. So the same way we use Cynthia's work to understand and know minoritized children, how do we use that same work to understand and know the teachers of color, the women of color, who are with great trauma and with, with great experiences of challenges, negative challenges, are saying, I'm still going to do it. I'm still going to go into that classroom in this white male dominant education system and endure all of these toxic, micro and full-on aggressions towards me because I want to be there for these children. And so even the framing of all of that, of how do we approach teachers in the future, is to consider we're not training people, we're educating these same young children who, yes, happen to be adults, but we've never addressed what they've experienced, right? We've never addressed what they've experienced in these education systems. So how do we teach them? How do we understand them? And how will that in and of itself support our children of color in these classrooms? It is, Cynthia, as you said, like, it's all together, right? It's all together. It's all part of that kind of whole system of supports that children need. So I just see it as, I'm biased, because this is the work that I do, but I see that as like this next phase of your work that I'm really excited to be a part of.
So it's terrible to have to conclude this conversation, but I know that we're not concluding, but just beginning the next conversation and the next discussion and the next phase of work that you have started. I want to say a special thank you to Foundation for Child Development for giving us the space and the focus for this conversation. And at this transition moment, a special thanks to Dr. Jacqueline Jones for her leadership and for creating these spaces. And Dr. Garcia Coll, we all thank you so deeply for the way your conceptualizations, research, community building, and contributions to organizations have changed the field of developmental science. We thank you for inspiration, for mentorship, and today especially for strength to face the dark shadows and the tragedies that arise from racism and pernicious discrimination and hate. Thank you for helping us see the way to strengthen resolve in such moments and tools to strengthen our children and youth. Panelists, thanks to each of you for your participation today in this webinar and for the important work that you are all doing. I hope participants will be reading your work as well and seeing the connections with Dr. Garcia Coll's. And thank you again for the Scholars of Color webinar series and for this series. And we thank participants for joining us today. Please delve deeper into today's discussions by accessing the materials on the website. Today's webinar has been recorded and we invite you to share it with colleagues. Thank you so much to all of you.
Yeah.